I'm pleased to introduce retired United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Paula Roderick as our guest speaker today. An Ohio native, she grew up in Wooster and was one of our Rotary Club's very first 3 Rotary exchange students outbound to, let's see if I can say it, Skelleftehamn, Sweden, just 60 miles south of the Arctic Circle. She enlisted in the Air Force during the closing years of the Vietnam War, and at that time, less than 3% of the military personnel were women, and fewer were still commissioned officers. Women in the military were restricted to a very short list of non-combat career fields, and were discharged for the service if they got married or pregnant. Military academies, pilot training, shipboard, and frontline duty were all off limits to women. Over the next 20 years, this trailblazer was able to participate in many of the changes that brought about the demise of these barriers. Today, women serving the United States military have the same career opportunities and obligations as men. After retiring from the Air Force in 1994, she and her husband, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel John Roderick, adopted a daughter, Catherine, from Russia and moved to Ponte Verde Beach, Florida in 1999. Pamela has been active in our local community with special focus on youth, education, and supporting the military. In addition to her part-time teaching in local schools, she's also been the founder and director of College Connections, an independent educational consulting firm that specializes in college admissions. Please give retired Lieutenant Colonel Roderick a warm Rotary welcome.
How is it, you might ask, that a quirky teen from a small farm town, struggling to be 16 and suffering from a painful lack of self-confidence, ends up sitting across the arms control negotiating table from grim-faced Soviet negotiators, as the only woman in the military on the team at the time she was 34? There are 2 simple answers: supportive parents and the Rotary Youth Exchange Program. Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. My name is Paula Roderick. I'm retired as you heard, I'm a retired Air Force officer and a Rotex, sponsored by this very club to Skelleftehamn. You're close, you're very close, Sweden, 1966-67. And thanks to President Terry and the board here, and special thanks to, excuse me, I'm a little nervous, to Frank and Sandy for hosting me. I'm able to be here today. It's my honor to be your speaker for your annual Veterans Recognition. This is my 4th time back as your speaker in the last 54 years, the last time being in 1994. But it's my first time speaking to you as a veteran. I've been asked to address, for probably obvious reasons, women in the US military. With that in mind, you're probably wondering what the possible connection could be between women in the military and Rotary Youth Exchange. Well, both RYE students and the women in the military face similar obstacles. Both RYE students and women in the military have to leave their friends, well, their friends and their family tend to question their motivation for wanting to do that, and they tend to discourage their participation in both cases. My parents thought I was out of my mind to want to go into the Air Force in 1974. And I also had a lot of people back in 1965 when I had interviewed with a bunch of really old men over at the Wooster Inn who were probably about 30 years younger than I am today. I had a lot of people wondering why I wanted to leave this beautiful farm town and go overseas. They also, women in the military and Rotary Youth Exchange students, you have to leave your family, your friends, and home behind. And you need to build new support and friend networks from scratch. And for those of you that haven't gone in yet, that's not an easy job. Ask your officers. It's hard to keep picking up stakes and move every couple of years and start all over, isn't it? But there's also a struggle in both of these cultures, RYE and women, for anybody in the military, ask our veterans here today, to fit into a new culture. When you leave your friends and your family and everything you know behind and you go overseas as an exchange student or you join the military, those are both new families and they're new cultures. And it takes a little while to fit in, but once you do, whether you're a Rotary exchange student, you're active duty military, guard or reserve, or you're a veteran, you found families for life that'll support you through thick and thin. Also, what we have in common as ROTEX, Rotary Youth Exchange students that have come home, or you're a woman in the military, is you have to have similar qualities to be successful. You have to have a strong work ethic and you have to have a lot of self-confidence. You need to have leadership and problem-solving skills. And most importantly, well, you need to have flexibility and adaptability to be successful. But I think what's most important is you have to have a really good sense of humor. Can you think of any other qualities that might help you to be successful in the military? What do you think? What helps you to be successful in the military?
Resilience.
Say again?
Resilience, yeah.
Resilience, absolutely. And anybody who has been a Rotary Youth Exchange student will tell you, if you've had to spend almost 3.5 months in total darkness and temperatures at 42 below zero, snow up to the second story, resilience comes in really handy. One of my favorite ROTECs, she was one of my outbound students from Florida about 10 years ago. She and I were talking about me speaking here today, and she said, be sure to tell them that one of the things that Rotary Youth Exchange students and women in the military have in common, she's the daughter of an Army officer. She said they both must learn to blossom wherever they're planted. And like an outbound who listed Italy, Switzerland, and Germany as her top choices for Rotary Youth Exchange. But when her YEO called her and wanted to know if she'd accept a slot in Sweden, her answer was, of course, absolutely. It's better to be an RYE student anywhere than not an RYE student. The same for women in the military. It's better to accept an initial assignment into the service as an admin officer, even though you felt you were much better qualified to be an intel officer since you spoke 5 languages, just to get a slot in the military before the war ends and the service lowers its recruiting numbers. Take a bird in the hand now, get in, and work on changing your billet or your job position later. Of course, that was me. I was offered a guy, what we call now a YEO, by a man by the name of Homer Hess. Anybody remember Homer? Yeah. A man by the name of Homer Hess said, Paula, do you want to go, will you take a slot to Sweden? And I said, Sweden, I thought I had Switzerland on there. And I, for a minute, thought it was the same country. And he said, yeah, if we'll take a slot to Sweden, you can go. And I was a smart girl. I said, sure, I'll take it. And good thing I did, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been an exchange student. And later on, my Air Force recruiter, I actually started my recruitment right down here at the Air Force recruiting office right here in Wooster. They called me and said, well, if you want to get in, they're closing things down for recruiting. It looks like the Vietnam War's winding down. Will you take a slot as an admin officer? And I said, I'm not well organized. You really don't want me to be an admin officer. He said, take it, or you're not going to get into the Air Force. I said, I'll take it. The rest was history. So what are some of the things that, looking forward, we're all aware, or actually looking back, we're all aware that for nearly 250 years, women have been involved in the defense of our nation. Whether it was Margaret Corbin with a musket in her hand, fighting beside her husband during the American Revolutionary War, or then Lieutenant Colonel Martha Sally, a former US Senator, rocking her A-10 Warthog over the skies of Iraq during the Persian Gulf War, American women have found ways to support or join with men to protect our Constitution and ensure our freedom. Sadly, however, despite women in the military's vital service over the decades, it wasn't until the Women's Military Services Integration Act of 1948 1776, 1948, that American women finally received permanent status, pay, and benefits. Prior to that time, women's roles were limited to what? What do you think the number one role was that women provided to the services? Say again? Nursing, absolutely. Vietnam War. That's about the time I came in, 1974. Vietnam War was still going on. At the end of the Vietnam War, 90% of all women who served in the military during Vietnam, 90% were nurses. 90% of all women. As late as 1976, that's what we were. What was another role in every combat, in every conflict in American history? There was one extremely critical role. Actually, General Washington, President George Washington, credited this role, which women have served in every conflict we've ever been in. General Washington said, this role helped us beat the British in the American Revolution. So what role have women participated in every conflict but never really got credit for? Spying. All the way back to the Revolutionary War, women were spies. And if you've ever seen that, there's a television program, I think called Turning Something. Women served in the Culper Ring. That was one of George Washington's critical spy rings. We know that there were at least two, but because that ring was so secret, we don't know the names of many of the men or the at least two women that were in General Washington's most important spy ring. And women have been spies going back all the way in history. Okay, so when women were given the right to vote in 1920 with ratification of the 19th Amendment, think about that. Women were serving in World War I, but couldn't vote. But as far as, let's step back at that moment. There was an important thing I forgot to tell you. There were a lot of civilian women who were almost like auxiliary members or contractors who served in World War I. We were talking about this, weren't we, just earlier? They were, I just learned this last week, there were 350 women contractors, worked for the Army, served in as switchboard operators in the trenches in France, right up on the front lines as switchboard operators in the trenches with all the diseases, all the filth, gas attacks, shelling, and the Germans coming through the trenches. 350, did you all know that? First World War, women were actually in the trenches. That was about as close as they got to combat legally at that point. Okay, moving back, I'm sorry. Well, women were given the right to vote in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. As far as women were concerned, the 1948 law had more serious implications. This is the Women's Military Services Integration Act than almost anything up to that point. That was both good and bad. The main purpose of that act was to give women permanent status in the active duty military. Before, when a war ended, you were out. Into World War I, into World War II, you were out. You didn't have any status anymore. Did anybody know Mitzi Saunders? Does anybody remember Mitzi Saunders? Mitzi Saunders was a WASP. She was a woman's air service pilot, flew ferried military aircraft from factories to the bases that they were going to be used. There were about 1,200 women who did this during World War II. There were several hundred of these women who lost their lives doing this, either through aircraft failure or there were some that were actually shot down. One woman is still MIA from that war, flying those planes. In any case, at the end of the war, they were gone. They received no recognition for what they did. They had no veterans benefits. And Mitzi Saunders helped lobby Congress to get WASPs recognitions as veterans. And that didn't happen until '77. But think about that. You served in combat roles, in combat situations, but you received no recognition, no veterans benefits. The law in 1948, the main purpose was to provide women in the military with permanent status, equal pay, and benefits. But it also codified other provisions which made it difficult for women in the military to achieve full integration. This included limiting women to 2% of all the branches, for both officers and enlisted, Women were, officers were banned from flag rank, couldn't be generals or admirals. Officers were banned from commanding men, and all women were banned from combat positions or serving in combat zones. There were also two things that could keep you or could have you automatically discharged from the military. What would that have been? Pregnancy and marriage. You couldn't be married and you couldn't be pregnant. Get you kicked out right away. It wasn't until 1973, just before I was commissioned, that the second major policy change was enacted. And this really fast forwarded the integration of women in the military. Does anybody know what happened in 1973? There should be quite a few of you in here that would know what that would be. And they ended the draft, absolutely. And this resulted in there not being enough men to fulfill the manpower requirements that DOD had. We were fighting we had a 2.5 war strategy, and we didn't have enough men to fulfill that. So the Department of Defense had to rely on women to fill the gap. And that's about the time that I came into the service. I came in 1974, that's when I was commissioned. And some of those changes, because of the end of the draft, because of the law of supply and demand, you've got all these billets you have to fill, all these positions you have to fill. You don't have enough men, you have to bring in women. So what they had to start doing was raising the limit on women. When I came in, I think Frank mentioned, it went from about 2% to 6% in a matter of a couple of years. We had our first women flag officers. They started, women started commanding men. They opened up pilot training. The Navy, one of the reasons I first went down to see the Navy recruiter here in Worcester is in 74, the Navy started training women pilots. And they were also, women were allowed to start commanding men. They also had navigator training was opening up to women. And particularly important to me is they opened up all the military service academies. They allowed women to get married starting in 73, and women were allowed to stay in after they became pregnant starting in 1975. And women, you'll all appreciate this. In about 1976, the Air Force started issuing women pants. Up until that time, maybe we had to wear skirts every day. That's pretty hard when you're at the Air Force Academy and the wind's coming off the mountains there at about 60 miles an hour and the temperature's about 20 degrees and you're wearing a skirt as you're crossing the terrazzo. Believe me, being issued pants was a highlight for me. But women were still banned from combat positions. One of the reasons opening the academies was important was it meant that women were eventually going to probably get to be general officers more often. But also for me personally, I left San Antonio, Texas, and I was out there to help integrate the first 2 classes of women cadets. The Air Force Academy was the only one that had what we call air training officers. There were 15 of us in the cadre, and we were there to act as surrogate upper class women to the first 2 classes of women cadets because our superintendent did not want to, in 1980, didn't want to see the women who were being commissioned. As his words were, I don't want to be graduating 100 women that are going to act like General Pattons in skirts. So that's why he brought us in. And what I found was that was one of my more challenging assignments in terms of dealing with decades of conservative male tradition, let's just say that, and a fair amount of sexual harassment. But the important thing was that we learned, we as women officers, and I think the women cadets that were there in those first 2 classes, we learned to deal with it in our own way because it was for the better good. We knew that young women like you would be coming along someday. And Frank and I were talking about this last night. It wasn't so much that we were trying to break the glass ceiling, we were trying to break down barred doors. You know, and we knew that you all would be coming along someday, and we didn't want it to be, we didn't want the people in this country to think that women were any different. We wanted it just to be an everyday occurrence that women were in the military and wearing BDUs. So that's, you know, you just put up with it. What you have to, as we said, you know, pull up your big girl panties and deal. So that's why we're there. And the reward came later when the class of 1980 held that was the first class with women cadets. When they held their 25th reunion at the Air Force Academy, the entire class dedicated a memorial. Kind of hard when you're still living. They dedicated a memorial to the air training officers. They had our names carved in granite. And in a room like this, in the association, matter of fact, very much like this, an association of graduates on a granite plaque about as big as those things up there on the wall. They had all 15 of our names engraved in granite, together with a touching tribute to what we had contributed to the Academy. So that years from now, just like Lee and Grant and those people up at West Point, your kids will see our names, and that made it all worthwhile. Okay, in the 1980s, we saw fewer changes for women in the military, but longer lists at first than I could ever cover in a week. On the Hill, Capitol Hill, the debate continued to rage about women being in combat, but women being a lot like Rotary Youth Exchange students, we were able to find ways to work around that. So in the early 80s, I was able to take a position as a woman, the Air Force's first, last, and only woman to command a combat cruise missile unit in Germany, nuclear cruise missile unit in Germany. Once again, I kind of ran into a fair amount of pushback for being in a non-traditional role. But that was coming pretty much from the officer leadership and not so much from the NCOs. Even guys who had served in Vietnam were pretty accepting because they appreciated that it didn't matter whether I was a man or a woman, as long as I took good care of their troops so they could take good care of the missions, they'd have my back. So I really loved going to the field with my troops, and I really loved being able to exercise some of the leadership skills that I had first learned when I was a Rotary Youth Exchange student. And my last several years in the military were times of real transition and rapid evolution for women in the military. And it's, you know, Candy and I were talking about this just before I came over here today. When you look back at the history of men in the military, why is it that there were so many generals that came out of West Point that, you know, that had graduated not so many years, like 20 years prior to the Civil War? And why was it that there were so many generals who came out of one or two classes, you know, the Pattons and the MacArthurs and the Eisenhowers? Why did so many generals come out of those few classes that those guys were in? Civil War, World War II. It's when individuals are in a crucible of war, of combat, that their full potential comes out, don't you think? And so women, up until about, you know, since 1948, when we had the right to stay in permanently, when I was in the service from 74 to 94, we didn't have any of that. We were pretty much still involved in the political implications of integrating women into the military. We were fighting those battles of being allowed to be in combat, be allowed to command men, all the things that the law of 48 had held us to. But then came the Persian Gulf War, 1990-91, and you know, McSally's flying, you know, combat jets and commanding fighter wings, and enlisted women are out there driving trucks, you know, in combat zones. And you know, where is a combat zone in modern warfare? Where is a combat zone in modern warfare? You can have a non-combat job, men and women, but you're all vulnerable. But it wasn't until the war on terror, what I call the war on terror, after 9/11, when women are over in the Middle East, that we really put women to the test, and they were in the crucible, that men, I think, in the military and our civilian leaders finally started to recognize that you don't judge women, just like you don't judge men in the military, on their gender. You judge them on their performance. And women, just like their male counterparts, have now had the opportunity to prove that they can do any job you give them. And that's when I think women have proven that we can do it. Give us the opportunity, give us the time and the place and the job, and we can get it done. And since 2001, things really started to roll. And in 2016, the Obama administration finally made it happen. And the law was changed and the services were directed, open every job in the military to women. If they can meet the requirements, if they can pick up that 20-pound toolbox and they can carry it the length of the room, if that's the requirement for men, if women can do the same thing and they can pass the training, you must give them the job. And if the guy beside her who maybe is 5'2" and he can't, and weak, and he can't pick up the same toolbox and get at the 20-yard, he can't do the job. You cannot put him in that position. Full equality for women was finally reached in 2016. You're at the right place at the right time. Okay? Thank you. So, our Rotary International President, Sikar Mehta, was quoted this month's Rotary magazine saying, "A few simple acts of service can immeasurably change lives." Looking back over the decades since our nation's founding, and especially over the nearly 5 decades since the end of the draft, women in the military have served and sacrificed beyond a few simple acts of service and have not only changed lives, but changed our nation. They have fought for 245 years for equal opportunities in the military, equal pay, benefits, and recognition, for the right for the right to live up to their oaths, share equally in the responsibilities and consequences of that oath, and for the respect that comes with being recognized as women warriors. This week, as we honor our nation's nearly 20 million veterans, including over 1.6 million women, and salute their immeasurable acts of service in defense of our Constitution, please remember their service has indeed changed not just lives, but our nation. Take a moment to shake their hand or fist bump them and include them in your prayers. Thinking back to that slightly taller but much thinner version of myself too many years ago to count, at least in public, I'd like to remind that young woman how it was that she came not only to sit at negotiating tables, but also to meet heads of state, be a friend to a real royal princess, dance at 2 inaugural balls, work together with patriots like General Colin Powell. It was a long and challenging career, but a fulfilling one. And the secrets behind my door to happy and successful career, if you asked me, I would tell you, just like I mentioned at the beginning, the love and support of my parents, Harold and Ann Gathright, who always demanded that I tell the truth in all things and encouraged me to dream big dreams at a time when women didn't have a lot of opportunities. Secondly, through Rotary Youth Exchange, I gained the life experience, self-confidence, grit, and gumption needed to properly deal with seemingly insurmountable challenges. With the leadership and life skills I gained from RYE, I had the courage to not just knock on locked doors, but when needed, to kick in a few. With the help of women in the military and forward-thinking, supportive leaders who are true Rotarians at heart, even though they'd never heard of the 4-way test. Without Rotary International and clubs like Wooster Rotary, tens of thousands of young people would never have had the opportunity to fast forward their growing up process, test themselves, and develop their leadership skills in a real crucible. And unlike what many women and men face in the military today, without RYE and clubs like Rotary, or clubs like this one here in Worcester, Rotecs around the world, myself included, would likely have missed out on many of the incredible opportunities that lie just ahead for young men and women like you, waiting for all of us just behind the next door. Taksumekat, Worcester Rotarians and guests and veterans. A very happy Veterans Day to all of you, and particularly those who served. And I'm so grateful to be here to see a veteran from World War II and Korea. And God bless America. Taksumekat, Hedo til næste gang. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Retired Roderick, for joining us today. And I'm sure you'd be willing to stay after folks have questions. Please come up and ask those questions. It was an honor to have you with us today and share your experiences, not only in youth exchange, but also with women in the military and breaking the glass ceiling. So we really appreciate your time with us today. I will say, and I'm sure it's okay if I share this, we were chatting last night and you said, you spent 6 years in Worcester, but when people ask where you're from, you say Worcester's your hometown. And I think Worcester is proud to claim you as their native native resident. So, in recognition of your time with us today, we have this rendition of the Rotary Wheel, the service above self with the four-way test on the back, and these are made locally by the Village Network.
Thank you
Thank you.
so very much.
All right, a couple of quick announcements. Next week, we will have Vic Shantz visiting us. Volunteer opportunities, if you want to help with flag return, see Tom Rumbaugh. If you want to help with the Al Van Wheat tournament, there's the online sign up, or you can see Becky Foster. And the design committee is going to meet with Ron Holtman here after the meeting today. And special thanks to Cheryl and Becky, who do a lot with our AV here. And I know today you did a lot for us, so thank you. Before we adjourn, if you would please stand with me in silence as we remember Rotarian veterans who have passed away in the last 5 years, and remembering all veterans, their families, and those that serve today in harm's way. Stanley Galt, June 29th, 2016. Joseph Hartzler, February 2nd, 2017. Lud Huck, January 31st, 2018. Sam Shapiro, February 15th, 2018. Bob Reed, January 20th, 2019. Gordon Giffen, February 19th, 2020. Robert E. Bodner, May 5th, 2020. David Briggs, June 13th, 2020. Robert Pete Bodner, February 28th, 2021. Thank you all for coming today. We stand adjourned.